I didn't plan to fall in love in a kitchen. Not the way people romanticize it. Candles, confessions, the kind of warmth that arrives like a movie cue. No. This was a renovated farmhouse kitchen with chipped paint under the new light fixtures, the faint smell of sawdust that never fully left the walls, and with floorboards that still complained when you walked from one room to the next. It was the place where deadlines turned into promises and promises turned into obligations, and where I learned that tenderness could be mistaken for control if you weren't careful. I had already told myself I was done with things that blurred boundaries. Graham taught me that lesson without trying. He didn't speak in sermons. He spoke like a man who had lived through consequences and learned how to survive them. He was a buyer, yes. He was also my client. My responsibility, in a way that never sat comfortably in my mind. I was selling the farmhouse, and he was buying it. But I didn't meet him the way most men met potential love at a bar, at a party, laughing at something stupid. In the dark, we met in a weekly schedule, a patient-client relationship, documented and careful. I saw him for therapy sessions in the back room of an office that smelled like peppermint tea and old paper. He came in with a composed face and a careful story, always arranged like he'd rehearsed it in the car. He insisted he was just working through stress, just trying to function better. And I believed him partly because I wanted to, and partly because he sounded like someone who had learned how to talk his way out of need. Then I showed him the farmhouse. It was supposed to be simple. Toured the place once with his friend Wesley, a big-hearted, practical man who laughed too loudly and helped move boxes with the earnestness of someone who didn't believe in empty time. After that, Graham came back alone, his hands in his pockets, his gaze moving slowly from the front porch to the renovated living room, where the new windows caught afternoon sun like warm glass. When he asked questions, it wasn't flirtation. It was due diligence. He kept asking, how much work is left? And what's the timeline? And is the foundation sound? When you do a job built on trust, you learn how to read the difference between sincerity and performance. Graham's questions were sincere, but when he said quietly, while standing on the staircase, "I wanted to feel safe," I heard something else in his voice. Not only the desire to make a home, a deeper plea, like he was trying to give his future self a place to breathe. That's how I should have stayed, at the level of client needs, at the distance of professional ethics. Instead, I sold him the farmhouse like I was handing him a container for all the fragile things he didn't know how to carry. My name was Colton. I'd been trained in boundaries and taught how to hold silence without turning it into cruelty. Yet the first time Graham picked up a paintbrush in the kitchen and asked, "Do you want me to do this part?" my chest tightened, like my body was surprised to find a heartbeat that didn't belong to the job. He didn't touch me at first. He didn't flirt, he didn't even linger. He worked. He arrived in work boots that left faint dust tracks on my freshly cleaned porch. He wore a plain grey hoodie, even though the air was warm enough for short sleeves, and he kept pulling at the sleeve cuff as if he needed to remind himself how to stay composed. When he carried boxes, he held them carefully, like he feared dropping them might break something fragile in the room. He was a patient man, slow, deliberate, the kind of person who could stand still while you explained the same thing twice. And I found myself explaining anyway. Because he asked, "What are you doing?" he'd say. "Why do you do it that way? Is it supposed to sit like that?" At first, his curiosity made sense. A buyer learning a house, a man who wanted to understand the work behind his future. But after the third visit, curiosity started to feel like attention. It started to feel like he wanted the sound of my voice, wanted the anchor of my presence while he moved through the rooms where he could imagine living. His attention was gentle, not demanding. That was the dangerous part. I told myself I was imagining patterns. I told myself that when people are lonely, they attach to what feels steady. I told myself he was still going through his process. I told myself I was just a professional who happened to be responsible for a sale. But then one rainy afternoon, when the sky pressed down in heavy grey sheets and the farmhouse windows fogged at the edges, he insisted on staying. "Just until you're done with the wiring," he said. His eyes, grey-blue, always watching for signs, held mine like he was waiting for me to say no. I should have refused. The tasks were mine. The schedule was mine. Our boundary was mine. Yet when he offered, when his shoulders squared, and he said it like a promise, "I can help," Colton, my stomach flipped in a way I hadn't felt during any session in the office. That was the first time I noticed how often I used his name in my mind, not during therapy, not as a case study, not even while discussing the contract, only when the house fell silent and we stood in the same air. Only when I caught myself wanting him to look at me like I wasn't a professional. Only when I wanted him to see me as a man. I didn't say any of that, of course. I worked in the kitchen, rerouting wires and explaining the plan, like it was simple. The rain drummed softly on the roof. He moved around me with careful distance, handing tools, holding the ladder steady, asking questions that weren't strictly necessary. "How do you know it's safe?" he asked as he held the flashlight. "Because I tested it," I said. He nodded, then watched my hands, the way someone watches a craft they don't fully understand, but desperately want to learn. There was a point where his attention made me dizzy. I finished the wiring faster than I needed to, then stood back and let the light flicker into place. The kitchen outlets worked. The new fixture lit. The house felt suddenly more alive. He exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for hours. Then, as if it was the most natural thing in the world, he wiped a smudge of dust from the corner of my jaw with his knuckle. It wasn't meant to be intimate. It was meant to be helpful, his hand reaching because he noticed, but my skin remembered touch before my brain could decide what it was. I froze. His hand froze too. For a moment, the rain, the hum of electricity, and the slow ticking of the kitchen clock disappeared. His eyes flicked to my mouth and then back to my eyes, like he was punishing himself for looking. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. It came out wrong, too fast. Apology as reflex. Guilt as armor. I swallowed. I wanted to say it was okay. I wanted to say I didn't mind. But I heard the ethics training in my head like a distant echo. I wanted the same thing he wanted. Safety, so I stepped back. I turned toward the counter and pretended I was busy organizing screws. "Don't worry," I managed. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. He picked up his flashlight again. He kept helping, kept moving, kept acting like that moment hadn't happened. But afterward, his kindness changed. Not in a dramatic, cinematic way. In a subtle way, like he'd put a fence back up around his heart, only he built the fence out of tenderness rather than distance. He became even more careful, less likely to lean too close, more likely to ask permission before touching the tools, before opening the fridge, before shifting a box. It was as if he was trying to prove to me that he was in control. And I wanted to believe him. I also wanted to believe myself. The truth was, I'd started waiting for him. Waiting for the knock on my door. Waiting for his silhouette in the rain. Waiting for the sound of his boots on the porch, for the way he always carried coffee like he'd learned that, offering it made people feel seen. I waited even when I promised myself I shouldn't. The farmhouse renovation was supposed to be a transaction, a buyer and a seller, a house changing hands. But Graham had become something else in my mind, the person who looked at me like I was a constant. And maybe that made him dangerous, because constant is what people want when their lives have become uncertain. My life wasn't uncertain, at least I told myself it wasn't. Yet the more Graham came around, the more I found myself thinking about what it would feel like to be chosen, not as a professional, not as a resource, not as an obligation, chosen as a man. I tried to stop it. I did. Told myself I would keep the sale strictly about paperwork and repairs. I told myself I would be warm, but not personal. I told myself I would never let our conversations drift into something that felt like intimacy. Then Wesley showed up with a box of light bulbs and a grin that practically begged for someone to laugh. "You're still here," Wesley said, stepping onto the porch with his keys jangling. "If the house tries to trap you, you just text me. I'll kick it." Wesley was the kind of man who filled rooms without realizing it. He carried humor like a tool. When Graham met his eyes, his face softened, and I watched the way their connection moved with ease. Graham wasn't alone in the farmhouse project. He had a support network. That helped. It made me feel less like I was intruding for a few days. I let myself breathe. We talked about flooring. We argued about whether a farmhouse sink was too impractical for everyday use. Wesley suggested a particular brand of stain and described it like it was a love story. Graham listened, smiled, and then turned back to me with an expression that felt too focused to be neutral. "Colton," he said one evening, after Wesley went home and the kitchen fell quiet, "can I ask you something?" "Not about the house." My body went still again. I stood by the counter, hands busy with nothing, screwdriver, tape measure, a useless list I'd been pretending to update. "You can ask," I said. He hesitated. The air between us tightened like a string pulled too far. "I'm trying to be better," he said. "I know," I replied. "I meant therapy." I meant coping skills, measured progress, the slow rebuilding of a person who had once learned to survive by shutting down. But he didn't stop. "I'm trying to be present," he continued. "And sometimes when I'm here, I feel like I could be present. I feel like I can breathe." I waited. My mouth was dry. He looked down at the floor, then back up. "Is it wrong that I want to be near you even when we're not doing sessions?" The words hit like a door, opening into a room I'd sealed. Wrong want near. Those weren't house topics. They weren't contract topics. My first instinct was to correct him, to restore boundaries, to remind him that therapy didn't equal romance. But his voice wasn't pleading for fantasy. It was pleading for permission to feel. And I realized he wasn't asking because he thought I'd reject him. He was asking because he needed to know what was safe. I opened my mouth. Then I closed it. In my mind, I pictured all the rules, all the ethics, all the potential harm if I answered in a way that turned his longing into a mistake. I could feel my heart drumming against my ribs like it was trying to escape. "It's not wrong to notice what you feel," I finally said carefully. "It's only wrong if you act in ways that hurt you, or hurt other people." His eyes widened slightly, as if that was the exact kind of answer he was hoping for. He exhaled, then nodded. "Okay." He didn't ask for more. But the next moment he moved closer, slowly like he was checking whether I would move away. He stopped at arm's length. "You always say we have to be honest," he murmured. My throat tightened. "I do," I admitted. He stared at me as if he was deciding whether honesty would be a risk or a relief. His hand hovered near my wrist, not touching, just close enough that the warmth of him reached my skin. Then, "Can I be honest?" he asked. My mind screamed no. My body answered yes. "I'd rather you were," I whispered. The silence after that was thick. His voice was barely above the hum of the refrigerator. "I'm not good at wanting people, but I want you, Colton. I want you in a way that scares me." My whole body went hot and cold at once. Because wanting him felt like a truth I hadn't admitted even to myself. And because Graham spoke like a man who had spent years being certain about who he could be, he spoke like he was still carrying the word straight, like it was part of his identity, part of his armor. Maybe he was, on paper. Maybe he had dated women before. Maybe his life story had been shaped by what was expected. But in this kitchen, with my hands trembling and my breathing uneven, he looked like someone standing at the edge of a cliff, deciding whether to jump into his own life. "Thank you," I said, and it sounded too fragile. He frowned a little, reading my expression. "That's all? No." I started, then stopped. My brain was trying to find the correct sequence of words to protect both of us. But protection was not the same as honesty. I swallowed, then told myself the truth. I couldn't keep treating my feelings like a problem to solve. I couldn't keep holding him at the exact distance where I was safe and he was not. So, I stepped closer, just enough that his hand finally met my wrist. His touch was careful. Testing, as if he was asking my body what it consented to. My pulse hammered. I felt his knuckles brush mine. "I'm not sure what you think you're asking me," I said quietly. "But I can't pretend I don't feel something." He sucked in a breath. His eyes searched my face like he was waiting for a betrayal. I hated how much he looked like he'd been hurt before. "I'm gay," I admitted, and the words came out like a confession I'd been holding in my throat for years. "And I care about you, Graham. I care in ways that aren't safe for me to ignore." The way his face changed was immediate. Not disgust, not anger, relief. Then devastation. Then something like awe. Because he didn't know if his honesty had just created a disaster. He didn't know if I would run. He didn't know if wanting me meant he was about to lose the one steady person in his life. "I didn't," he started. His voice cracked. "I didn't know," I said, gentler than I felt. "That's why you're scared. That's why you kept asking what was safe." His eyes glistened, reflecting the kitchen light. "I keep thinking," he whispered, "that I'm stealing something from you. Like I'm taking your time and your heart, and you didn't sign up for it." I shook my head slowly. "You didn't steal anything. You were honest. You came here. You asked me to be real." He stared at my mouth again, like my words had become a doorway. Then he pulled back. He stepped away as if he'd been burned. "I can't," he said quickly, and I felt him try to reassemble his armor. "I'm still." "Still what?" I asked. N. Swallowed. "Still not whatever this is." I nodded, even though my chest hurt. "You don't have to label it right now." "But you deserve someone who knows," he said. I almost laughed, but the sound caught in my throat. "You don't get to decide what I deserve." "And I don't get to decide what you feel." His gaze flickered, like he was trying to hold back tears and failing. "I'm trying to be straight for the rest of my life," he confessed, voice low. "Because it's what people expect. Because it's what I can explain. Because it's what I know how to be." The honesty was raw, and it made my love feel heavier, not lighter. I wanted to fix it for him. I wanted to promise him there would be no consequences. But love wasn't that kind of magic, so I did the only thing I could do that felt like real integrity. I told him the truth about my own fear. "Me too," I admitted. Not straight, obviously, but afraid. Afraid of what I want. Afraid of what wanting you would cost. He blinked. "Then why are you saying it?" "Because if I don't," I said, voice trembling, "I'll spend the rest of my life wondering what would have happened if I chose honesty. And I can't do that." "I can't do that to you." He stared at me for a long time. Then he nodded once, small and decisive. "Okay?" He came closer again, this time without hovering. His hand steadied at my waist. His touch was warm, firm, like he was finally done pretending his body didn't have an answer. I didn't kiss him right away. I asked softly, "Are you sure?" He swallowed. "Yes, I'm sure." Then his mouth met mine, careful at first, like he was afraid to ruin something delicate. But the kiss deepened the longer we stood there, because the need in him didn't fade. It turned into something braver. It still wasn't explicit. It wasn't a sudden fireworks explosion. It was slow, trembling, honest. And when we pulled apart, his forehead rested against mine. His breath shook. "Holy," he started, then stopped, laughing like he couldn't figure out what to do with joy. I smiled, small and shaky. "Don't make this into a miracle," I murmured. "Make it into something we can survive." He drew back slightly, eyes searching. "We can survive it." "We can try," I said. But my chest was still full of dread. Because there was still the other side of our life. The sessions, the ethics, the ways people might misunderstand, the ways mistakes might become irreversible. And the next part of our story wasn't about a grand gesture. It was about choices made again. And again, the next morning, Wesley arrived with a truckload of supplies. He whistled when he saw the kitchen finished. "Look at you guys," he joked. "Colton, you should charge Graham for motivation." Graham froze for half a second, then forced his smile into place. I watched his face carefully. He looked like a man trying to build a new reality with his hands. Wesley didn't notice. Wesley rarely did. He was kind enough to notice only what he wanted. During the day, Graham stayed in my orbit, like a man who'd learned his orbit had gravity. He helped with tasks, kept the conversation light, laughed when Wesley made jokes. But when the others weren't around, his eyes found mine too often. Like he was checking that I was still there, like he was terrified I'd evaporate. In the late afternoon, after Wesley left, the rain returned. Gentle this time, almost polite. I sat at the kitchen table, with my notes from therapy sessions that I should have reviewed. But my mind wouldn't stop replaying his confession. I heard his voice. I felt his hand. I also felt the weight of what I'd just done, emotionally, ethically, personally. When Graham returned, his keys clinked loudly on the porch. He looked different in the dim light of the evening. Softer, more open, like he'd decided not to hide. He walked in and stood across from the table. "I want to talk," he said. My stomach clenched. "Okay." He pulled a chair out slowly, sat down like he was approaching something fragile. "I know what it looks like," he began. "What does it look like?" I asked, even though I knew. "It looks like I got what I wanted," he said, voice low. "It looks like I used my position, with your trust to be close." "No," I said quickly. Then I forced myself to slow down. "Graham, I want you to hear me. I didn't feel used. I felt seen." "And you were honest." His lips pressed together. "I'm not sure I deserve that honesty," he whispered, "because I still don't know how to be the kind of man you want." I stared at him. This was the core conflict that wouldn't go away. Not because he was cruel, not because he was selfish, but because his fear was real. He didn't want to hurt me. He didn't want to be the reason I lost my job, my peace, my sense of safety. And I didn't want to be the reason he convinced himself that desire had to be punished. So I did what I should have done earlier. I offered structure. "Here's what we do," I said carefully. "We don't pretend we're fine. We don't let this blur into a secret that keeps getting heavier. We talk honestly, with terms. We talk about boundaries like adults." His eyes widened slightly. "You want boundaries now?" "I always wanted boundaries," I replied, "but I wanted them with you, not around you." He stared at me like that made sense in a way he hadn't expected. "Okay," he said. The word was small, but it felt like a door opening. We talked for an hour. We spoke about what I could and couldn't provide as a therapist once the relationship crossed into personal territory. We spoke about how we needed to step back from direct sessions. We spoke about whether we should inform anyone at the office, and whether we even could. Graham kept blinking rapidly when the conversation turned serious, like he was trying to keep himself from drowning. I kept my voice steady. I didn't reassure him with fantasies. I reassured him with options. When we reached the end of the conversation, it was already late. Graham looked at the kitchen clock. "It's too late to drive," he said. That was an ordinary statement, but the tone beneath it wasn't. I could feel the question, the hope, the plea for closeness without consequence. I could have insisted he leave. I could have returned to my own bedroom and turned this into a story I told later, at a distance. But I was tired of pretending. "Stay," I said. Voice shook as soon as I said it. "But we stay respectful. We stay slow. And tomorrow we keep talking." His face crumpled slightly, like he couldn't believe he'd been offered something so simple. "Thank you," he whispered. He stood up, then paused, like he didn't know where to put his hands. He touched my cheek again, softer than before, as if he was testing whether I'd still be real when he woke up. Then he went to the guest room. I didn't sleep. Not because I was afraid, because my heart had been forced awake, and it kept pacing through possibilities. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle. The renovated farmhouse creaked in its new places, a familiar sound that used to comfort me because it meant stability. Now it felt like it was warning me. What if this was only temporary? What if tomorrow he regretted it? What if the guilt took over and he vanished like he'd done in the past with other parts of his life? I thought about his earlier confession. I want to be straight for the rest of my life. What if honesty was just a phase? What if he wanted me today and forgot me tomorrow? It wasn't fair to ask him to become someone else instantly. It wasn't fair to ask myself to survive uncertainty without breaking. Still, the deeper fear was different. What if my feelings were real and they could cost me everything I'd built? Morning came anyway. The sun slid through the windows and made the kitchen look like a painting. I washed my face, then stood in the doorway, waiting. Graham came out quietly. He looked like he'd slept for 10 minutes and spent the rest of the night awake. His hair was slightly messy, his hoodie sleeves pushed up, as if he'd started to move before he'd decided whether he could. When his eyes met mine, his expression shifted into something tender and terrified. "Good morning," he said. "Morning," I answered. We moved toward each other slowly, like we were learning how to walk without stepping on a bruise. He kissed my knuckles. It made my stomach flip in a way that felt too young for a man my age. He pulled back and whispered, "I'm sorry about last night." My brow furrowed. "For staying?" "No," he said. "For wanting you. For making you deal with my mess." The phrase hit like a weight on my chest. I took his hands in mine, feeling his warmth, his pulse. "Graham, your feelings are not a mess. They're just feelings. They're human." He swallowed, eyes shining. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "Neither do I said. "But we can do it honestly." He nodded once. Then he told me something he hadn't said before. "Unafraid of being wrong," he whispered. "Wrong about what?" He looked away, then back. "About who I am," I understood. Not because I'd lived his exact history, but because I'd lived my own kind of wrong. The kind where you keep your truth locked away until it turns into a prison. I couldn't fix his identity, but I could help him take the next step. "Then don't decide everything at once," I said. "Decide what you can do today. Today, you can be honest. Today, you can choose kindness. Today, you can tell me what you need." He exhaled and leaned his forehead against my chest. "I need you to not disappear," he said. I closed my eyes, because that was the simplest request and the hardest to promise. "I'm here," I said. He lifted his head and looked at me like he needed to memorize my face. Then he nodded toward the living room, toward the paperwork stack I'd left on the table. "We need to talk about the sessions," he said. "Yay!" I replied. We sat at the kitchen table again. This time, the conversation didn't feel like ethics. It felt like survival planning. He asked questions about what would happen to him. I explained in steady terms what it meant for therapy to shift. He asked if he'd done something wrong. I told him again, no, but I also told him the truth about consequences. I can't pretend our roles can stay the same, I said. If we keep moving forward, I have to step back professionally. But that doesn't mean I step away emotionally. It means we rebuild. He stared at me like he was trying to absorb the idea of rebuild instead of ruin. I don't want to lose you, he whispered. You won't, I promised, and I meant it. Not as a romantic guarantee, as a decision. That afternoon, Wesley returned with lunch. He made it like a ritual, setting sandwiches and chips on the counter, like he was feeding a family. He noticed our quietness, but he didn't dig. He never knew how. Graham smiled at him, but his gaze kept returning to me. Like even in jokes, he was checking where I stood. It was exhausting and sweet, because I wanted to be seen by him and terrified of being too obvious. Later, when Wesley went back out to check the last of the plumbing, Graham took me aside into the living room where the renovation had left exposed beams. The walls smelled like fresh wood and primer. There was a ladder in the corner and a roll of insulation, leaning like a sleeping animal. He stood close, not touching yet. I'm going to say something, he said. I nodded. He took a breath. Last year, I dated a woman. I convinced myself it was what I wanted. I convinced myself I was normal. My throat tightened. He kept going, voice trembling. I did it because I was scared. I did it because my family would have expected me to. I did it because I didn't want to be the kind of man people point at. He looked at me like he was asking me not to point. I'm not asking you to forgive my past, he said. I'm asking you to understand why I'm so careful. Why I try to keep the word straight alive. Because it makes me feel safe. His confession made me ache. Because I didn't doubt him. I believed he had lived in that word for years. Then he whispered, but safety can't be everything, I think. I think I'm done choosing fear. The room felt still. I reached out and slid my fingers along his sleeve, feeling the fabric, the warmth underneath. Then stay with me, I said, in the only way we can by telling the truth, even when it's inconvenient. His breath caught. He leaned in and kissed me again, slower this time, like a man learning a new language with his mouth. When we pulled back, his forehead rested against mine. I want to try, he whispered. That's all I ask, I replied. But trying wasn't a fantasy. It meant hard conversations. That evening, we sat in my car parked outside the farmhouse because the air inside felt too charged. The sky was a deep navy. Street lights cast a soft amber glow across the windows. We watched the farmhouse porch light flicker once before settling into steady illumination. Graham held the steering wheel with both hands like it anchored him. I keep thinking, he said, that you're going to wake up and regret this. I turned my head, looking at him in the side glow. Do you think I regret it? His jaw tightened. I don't know what you feel. The words were honest, but the pain under them was familiar. I knew what it meant to be unable to trust your own happiness. I feel happy, I said carefully, and scared, and grateful, all at once. He blinked quickly. That doesn't sound like regret. No, I said. It sounds like love trying to grow in the middle of fear. He swallowed. Then tell me you're not going to run, he begged. I reached across the center console, letting my fingertips find his wrist. I'm not running. I'm moving carefully. There's a difference. He let out a breath that sounded like relief and grief tangled together. I'm going to tell Wesley something, he said suddenly. I tensed. What? He glanced at me, eyes searching. That I'm not straight the way I thought. That I can't pretend. He's my friend. He deserves the truth." The courage in his voice made my chest hurt. I thought of how many times he'd likely practiced denial in front of mirrors. Now he was choosing honesty over convenience. "Okay," I said. "I'll be there if you want me to." He nodded once. "I'll be there if you want me to." He nodded once. Then he looked forward, like he was preparing to step into cold water. We went inside when Wesley came back. The kitchen was warm from the new lights. The farmhouse smelled like dinner, something simple, something Graham insisted on cooking, even though his hands still shook every so often. Wesley leaned against the counter and watched us, with an expression that tried to be casual. "Okay, you two are acting like a hostage video. What happened?" Graham stood still. Then he turned to Wesley fully. He took a breath, and his voice, so controlled for so long, came out raw. "I think I'm in love," he said. Wesley blinked. Then his grin faltered. "With who?" Graham looked at me, and I felt that look like a hand over my heart. "With Colton," he said. My name hung in the air, simple and devastating. Wesley stared for a second too long. Then he laughed, but it wasn't mocking. It was the kind of laugh that tries to catch up to reality. "You, Graham, you sure?" Wesley asked, voice unsteady. Graham nodded slowly. "I'm sure I feel it. I'm not sure I understand it. But I'm sure I don't want to live pretending anymore." Wesley stepped back from the counter, running a hand through his hair. "Dude," he breathed. "You could have told me you were, you know." "I tried," Graham said. "I tried to keep it straight. I tried to keep my life explainable, but every time I was with Colton, I felt like I was lying to myself." The way Graham said lying made it sound like self-harm. Wesley's eyes softened. He looked at me, then really looked, and something in his face shifted from surprise to recognition. Like he'd always suspected there was something steady about me that went beyond a job. "You're good to him?" Wesley asked. I nodded, throat tight. "I'm careful," I said, "and I'm honest. I won't hurt him." Wesley's mouth trembled. "I don't know how I'm supposed to hold this," he admitted. Graham walked closer, but this time he didn't rush. He stood a respectful distance from Wesley, like he wasn't claiming ownership. "You don't have to hold it alone," he said. Wesley swallowed. Then, unexpectedly, he stepped forward and hugged Graham hard, awkward, sincere. Graham stiffened at first, then melted into the embrace, like he'd been starving for permission to be cared for without being judged. When they separated, Wesley wiped his face with the back of his hand and muttered, "God, I hate feelings. I hate that I love you guys." We laughed softly. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't perfect, but it was real. After dinner, the house quieted again. Wesley fell asleep on the couch with his socks still on. Graham and I stood by the kitchen sink, hands washed, minds still buzzing with what we'd done. What we'd admitted. "I did it," he said softly. I nodded. "You did." He leaned his head back against the cabinet, eyes closing. "Now I'm scared again." "Of what?" He opened his eyes. "Of the future. Of whether I can become a man who doesn't run when it gets real." My chest tightened. Then he said, "Hold me." It wasn't sexual. It wasn't demanding. It was a request for comfort. So I stepped forward and pulled him into my arms. He fit against me like he'd been waiting to fit somewhere safe. His hands rested on my back, fingers splaying like he was learning the shape of trust. We stayed like that until the house settled into deeper quiet. Later, when Wesley finally stirred and left for the spare room, Graham and I sat in the living room, under the warm light of the renovated lamp. The couch looked new enough to hope, but the blanket was old, and slightly rough, and I liked that it wasn't perfect. Perfection would have felt like pressure. We talked about tomorrow like it wasn't a threat. We talked about the last bits of the renovation. We talked about the contract closing date. We talked about how we might handle the step back from sessions. But beneath all the practical talk, we were doing something else. We were choosing each other again and again. At midnight, the farmhouse windows darkened. The porch light stayed on, a small, steady beacon against the night. Graham stood and walked toward the hallway. He stopped and turned back to me. "Are you going to be okay if we stop pretending?" he asked. I didn't answer immediately. I thought about the rules. I thought about the fact that love could be complicated without being wrong. Then I stepped closer and took his hands. "I'm going to be okay," I said, "because I don't need you to be a new person. I need you to be honest, and you've been brave." His eyes glistened. "So are you," he whispered. I kissed him again, slower, more certain. The kiss wasn't a climax, it was a promise made with our mouths. When we finally walked into the bedroom, the house didn't feel like a transaction anymore. It felt like a refuge built from patient choices. The bed creaked softly when we sat on the edge. He looked at me like he was trying to memorize the way I held myself. "I'm still scared," he admitted. "So am I," I said. "But we're not alone in it. We didn't talk about destiny. We didn't promise forever. We promised honesty. We promised that if fear came, we would face it together instead of turning it into silence." That night, the farmhouse felt like it was holding our breath, with us old bones and new light, the past and the future trying to agree. And when the first hint of morning arrived, we were still there, still choosing, still learning how to be real. Not because it was easy, because we were finally done running.